Hey everyone, just giving about a minute or two to give people some time to join, but I will be with you shortly. Hey y'all, we're about ready to kick things off. It looks like people are trickling in. So I will give another about 15, 20 seconds and we'll start this thing. Okay, great. So welcome to the CircleCI demo. If you're here for the demo, you're in the right place. And I am Ryan Pedersen. So I'm a senior solutions engineer at CircleCI. And I'll be leading the demonstration today. Some quick housekeeping items. If you there's going to be a Q&A. I'm going to do my best to monitor during natural breaking points, but excuse me if I don't get to it, but it definitely will be a big chunk of time at the end for questions. So any open questions or any comments there, if you can't see anything, let me know, just put it in the Q&A feature because that's what we'll be monitoring. And in terms of what we are planning to cover, this is the agenda. Going to start off by setting the stage, so the who and the what. We'll jump into the underlying architecture, so how everything works, and then we'll get into the product demo, where I'll get to level set with a more granular agenda once we get there, and we'll actually go through the product from end to end. Okay, so if you're sitting there wondering who this demo is for, I'm not going to make you wait for an answer. First off, it's for the developers, so plenty to gain around agility and empowerment around devs. It's for DevSecOps, so generally security teams. We'll cover how to make sure everyone follows policies and how to manage risk. Then it's for platform engineering and developer experience, so what we can do for enablement, cost control, and visibility. And then how it works. So beyond that, some things that we'll be hitting on during the demo. So how it works, nuts and bolts, developer happiness. We want to talk about how this loosely translates to quick feedback, letting them focus on their jobs and not CI/CD. Then ensuring adherence to security policies, and then finally how you can gain visibility. And now that we've set the stage on that, let's go ahead and define some of the terms. So these are all the things that we're going to touch on in more detail later, but I want to introduce them here and define them before we really get into it. So I want to start this off with the important concept of config as code. Everything we're going to see is defined in the config file. So in terms of the important terms and how they relate, let's go ahead and define them. The highest level in CircleCI is a pipeline. When we're saying pipeline, you could think of it as all the workflows triggered on your project with the relevant parameters. You can really think of it as your config file itself, the relevant context from the trigger, and the body of work needed to validate. Workflows coordinate a set of related work from start to finish, so it's the orchestration of jobs, which job is running in which order. A job is a collection of steps run in the execution environment that you specify, and then a step is the smallest segment of work, just a command run during a job. So again, all this is defined in the config file in source control. You might be happy because you love config as code, but you might also be worried about looking for a way to apply some guardrails. Config policy management is a way to enforce org and project-wide policies on configurations. So it allows admins and operators to write and manage rules. It can either block processing or just log usage for different violations. I want to talk about now some flexibility with those guardrails attached. So I said each job is defined in the config file, and a job is a collection of steps in an execution environment. With CircleCI, there are a lot of options for you to choose from here in terms of environments. You can choose from one of our cloud environments. So Docker, Mac, Windows, VM, ARM, there's a lot of options. You can choose from your own self-hosted runner also. We see a workflow using a lot of them together on the left. And on top of that, for our cloud resources, we have a large variety of resource classes available. So we see our example Docker executor resources on the right. So anywhere from 20 CPUs, 40 gigs of RAM down to 1 CPU, 2 gigs of RAM. So it really lets you find your perfect Goldilocks zone. In the config, you can absolutely script out all of the commands you want in the environment that you specify, but you can also think dry and you can utilize orbs. Orbs are CircleCI's package manager. They are reusable configuration as code. So think best practices, custom scripting, all these bundle up nicely into few or single lines of configuration. A few examples here from our registry of partner and CircleCI orbs to help you accomplish whatever you need. Okay, so now that we have covered the basics, let's get on to the demo. Let me switch over my screen. Okay. In terms of the product demo, I want to let you know what we're going to see and what you can expect. By happenstance, this all mirrors the docs pretty well. Nothing I am telling you is going to be, let me make sure my screen share okay. Nothing I'm going to tell you is impossible to find yourself in the docs, but I want to highlight the most relevant pieces, the ones that I see high-performing teams focused on. So coming away from this, I want you to feel like you have a focused list of must-dos when onboarding to CircleCI. Our journey today is going to start by seeing those terms, the config hierarchy. We're going to see those in CircleCI. Then we're going to follow a change through a pipeline. So running security checks, testing, building and pushing an image and getting it out to a dev cluster where we can do some end-to-end testing on it. Here we'll be hitting on speed, scalability, and security. Beyond that, just we want to dig deeper into the config itself. So how to make it more reusable, how to use third-party tools, and then we'll jump into insights. Then there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions, as well as a couple other bolt-on topics, depending on time. So around like dynamic configuration, mobile builds, self-hosted runners, those kind of things. So I'm going to jump now into the pipelines page. Jump here. So as CircleCI, the pipelines page is where you get a bird's eye view as an operator of what's going on across the org. I can filter at the project. I can filter at the branch level. I can filter by past failed workflows. And again, a pipeline is all of the workflows triggered on your project with the relevant parameters. They're kick off when there's a commit. I can kick a new one off with the API, or I can kick a new one off in the UI from the head of the branch selected with some optional parameters. And then a workflow, again, is just which job is running and in which order. So inside of an older pipeline, I could also rerun a workflow that has the same configuration as tied to that original trigger. And I'll see a good amount of work running here as well. So that'd be multiple running. We see a huge amount of workflows at a big team. Running CircleCI, you have unlimited horizontal scale, so developers don't need to queue or wait for build resources. Why that's important to us is by eliminating queuing, having that ability to scale, you can increase deployment frequency. You don't have to worry about what on and off hours might be. Just commit when you're ready. One level down from here is the workflow. Workflow, again, is just the orchestration of jobs. Each box that we see here is a job. They're each their own independent, ephemeral environment, spun up on demand, torn down after. We're not reusing them ever. They can each be, again, their own platform with differing levels of vertical scale. So, it can have all these be different things. Docker machine, Windows, the self-hosted versus cloud-hosted, Windows, ARM, GPU, Mac, whatever flavor you want, you name it. Because there's so many options, like platform teams know they're able to support whatever the developers in the org throws their way. And something important here beyond the flexibility in terms of architecture is that ephemeral nature. So these are totally isolated from each other. These jobs don't know about another unless we tell it to. And they each focus on the right resource for the right job. and they focus on the specific thing they need to accomplish. And then a job is a collection of steps run on top of an execution environment. I come in here briefly to highlight a couple things that make life easier in terms of navigation and troubleshooting. I can see the environment here. This is run inside of a Docker image, and then I'm running steps in that environment. I have the logs and exit codes for each step here. So I can see what's going on easily, quickly. And because that's all that's happening, the one thing to remember when setting up or troubleshooting is if you can do something in a local Linux, Mac, Docker environment, you can do the same thing here. All right, so now that we have covered the UI basics, we're going to get into some change validation. And I'm actually going to start this story like in the middle, like in the perspective of a developer. So let me jump over. I'm building, in this case, a bank app. This is one that my team manages, maintains. It's full-fledged. It's called the Bank of Ion. I have a dev cluster here with access to all the full functionality, and then I have a production cluster over here. This is my production app. So in my case, I want to get something out to production before I head out, and I don't want to have to go through the full approval process. I made a few changes. I promise it's okay. But this separation of concerns, this is something that of keeping the production access on only on main branch. It's something that DevSecOps mandates. In this case, we can see that the pipeline actually checks for it and doesn't process because it violates the policy that we've had set up. So config policy management lets you enforce those policies. It's really valuable. Developers can be empowered to own their own configs and pipelines, while DevSecOps and platform team both know there won't be any security or policy adherence issues. In your case, you might have hundreds of repos and you want a holistic approach without having to treat them all as separate entities. Here you can have cohesion, but also if you want to, just log different orb usage, see if people aren't using orbs that you create, and different resource classes tied to certain projects, you can absolutely have that flexibility to also do that and log the usage. In my case, the developer has to play by the rules, but not to worry. There are plenty of other ways to reduce workflow duration and to increase throughput. So I'm going to actually jump into the IDE. And I'm going to pull up my terminal. I'm going to fix this thing up. All right, so I did fix this thing up. Let me just tidy this a bit. All right. So I fixed up the issue in the config and I kicked off some work. This is my command center. So as a dev, this is where I had spent a lot of my time. And from my shoes, I'm able to run this commit and get feedback actually really quick, a lot quicker here. So you might recall when I was on the CircleCI's pipelines page, I said that's where the operator gets a bird's eye view across the org. Now, as a developer, I'm using the Visual Studio Code plugin from CircleCI, and this is where I get my bird's eye view. This is everything I need is right here. I don't have to worry about jumping and context switching. I see all the pipelines that I kicked off. They're all where I live. I don't have to jump around, navigate to a UI, really whatever. And so with the linting, I want to get shallow feedback and I want to get it fast. If this does not compile or if it has an issue, I'm going to run a linting job and fail this thing quick. It's the first piece of validation. It's the first line of defense. And the Java check style job, another way to make this faster, I'm also utilizing dependency caching. So I can reduce the time spent on the process of installing dependencies to nearly zero when our packages haven't changed. This could also be in a really small resource class. I don't need much available for this simple piece of work. It's really great from an operational perspective, because if this does fail, you won't provision more resources. The pipeline just stops here. So it's really the perk of everything being on demand. And good news, the linting passes. So now that I've run that linting job, the next piece of feedback, past that quick superficial feedback, is running some more intensive work with unit testing. I want to get deeper feedback on what changed. I want to see if it's okay to get out. So as a developer, I want green all the time. In reality, sometimes things do not go to plan. I can pull this test up here. And I can see actually this thing did fail. Now, once I see the failure, once I see the red, the name of the game is reducing mean time to recovery. The first line of defense is here in the IDE. Usually I can get all I need to right here. As a dev, I don't want to jump back and forth to troubleshoot. I just want to figure out things as quick as possible. I can jump into this testing job. I can see the test results. I can pull the one up that failed and see actually what went wrong. If I want to get more info, I can jump into the jobs page and I can see that same thing. So same thing I just saw on the jobs page as the operator. I get that entire job view here, the same one as the UI with the logs and exit code. It's all in the details tab. So I can see the failed test and figure out the reasoning why. I get the logs and exit codes for that. So this is really great for the developer's workflow, because if they're focused on their changes and really want to get the feedback they need, they don't want to be context switching. Everything is right here. Now, I do have another way to troubleshoot further if I want. I can rerun this job with SSH enabled. So maybe you actually need to get into the build container to see what's going on with nvars, or you want to check out the correct path for something. This is the way to go about doing that. Even if you want to do more broad troubleshooting, this is quick and easy, gets you right in. So I'm actually in the terminal, sets up the terminal session right here for me to do that with that plugin. All of these options let me as a developer fix the failure as quickly as possible. And I do want to note that everything we just saw now is also available in the UI. So I can open in the browser. It'll direct me to the job, the test that failed here. And I can also see that rerun with SSH option up here. I can see there's a SSH job running. I can rerun from the start, the workflow. I can rerun the workflow from when it fails, not to run the preliminary jobs first. I want to highlight again the SSH debugging piece. I don't want to undersell it. I've talked about it twice now. Developers absolutely love this. In addition to making the devs happy, it lets platform teams enable developers to troubleshoot on their own without running something up to a central team, filing a ticket, something that might be a bottleneck. Really, it's a win-win here. Now, of course, that was a failed test, but hopefully there's going to be some ones that do go well, and hopefully more often than not. With that failed test, and that's the way to speed up the time to recovery, but now I want to get this thing out. So I can see another unit test suite here. This one does pass. So in addition to dependency caching, we have some other really nice mechanisms, so ways to help speed this up even more. We have a built-in test splitting mechanism. This lets you split all the tests over however many nodes you define. And you can split this by timing data, so it all finishes close to the same time instead of splitting at random. What this means, if you have a test suite with 1,000 unit tests that are taking 30 minutes, you can split that full thing up over parallel nodes and do it in a matter of minutes and get that really rapid feedback. Really powerful. One of the first things I always recommend to implement. Hey, Doug, I saw your question. I'll come back to that later. All right, so after we've run the validation on the source code itself, we need to produce an artifact and send it somewhere. So let's go back to this workflow. You can see here, I am building a Docker image in this job, and I'm updating my cluster with the new image in the next. We are going to send this image to our Nexus instance. So I'm using this as a Docker registry. And in order to let Nexus know it's us, we're getting our short-lived credentials using OIDC from a Vault instance. OIDC and working with Vault or secrets managers are very common requests from the DevSecOps folks. So that's absolutely an easy way to go about doing that. And for building the Docker image piece, another speed lever here is Docker layer caching. Now, with everything being ephemeral, we want to also make sure we don't have to build from scratch. So this lets us build the Docker image. It'd be really similar to building locally, and you see the cache hits. So get some cache there. That's another really efficient way to reduce workflow duration. I can see I build this Docker image in 11 seconds. Now we push that image out to Nexus there, and we're moving along in the pipeline journey. Update in the deploy dev. So we're able to run the same process to authenticate with another resource. In this instance, it's our dev cluster and EKS, getting my credentials from OIDC with Vault. But because I'm on a dev branch, I have access to the dev credentials for that, which is certainly keeping the security folks happy. I don't have what I don't need, what I tried to do earlier. And then down here, we're going ahead and running some kubectl commands and getting this deployed. And then also updating our status down here in Atlassian Compass. Although this could really stand in for any third-party tool where you want to get information out to. Doing this with another API key, another nvar that we're storing. So a lot of these like nvar and the structure, like a really good and common like requests that we get. It's a good opportunity to consult with our team on security posture, how to restrict these with CPM, include and take some of the abstraction layers away from the end developer and to find a scalable policy. So something our team's really good at consulting on. It's also a really good example of something to future-proof and use orbs, get this stood up in a really repeatable way. So secrets management, keeping it secure and dry makes DevSecOps happy with ensuring policies, platform happy because it's repeatable, and developers are happy because they don't have to worry about either of those things. They just focus on getting their changes out. To close the loop on what we were just doing, you can see here, we're coming out and we are checking the deployability of the apps. We're running some end-to-end tests on the dev environment itself and seeing if it's in a deployable state before we merge it over to main. So we're running some Cypress tests over here. And I'll pause again because there was a question around finding docs for setting up something similar, pipeline with Jest. I actually have I have a blog post on doing this with Jest. So if you do a CircleCI test splitting blog post by me, type in my name, it'll come up, and there's actually a repository with Jest as an example. So that'd be a good one to go ahead and do. And we can follow it up in the docs after this to get you an email if you have any more questions. Okay. So now back to the config. I'm going to close some of this up to not overwhelm. All right. So now that pipeline's done, here's the config file. We're going to talk shop a bit. What we're going to see is standard YAML. It's going to be familiar for folks who work with modern DevOps or infrastructure tools. In terms of things that live inside of the config, the mandatory pieces are workflows and jobs, and then the version stanza clarifying version 2.1. In the workflows and jobs, these mirror what we just saw in the UI. So what we just saw was the main workflow with a number of jobs doing, these things that we specified. So the workflow has this dependency graph and a few keys with different branch filters. You can create that full graph and filter by different branches and tags, and you can give, job access to different groups of credentials. You can see I'm using the CircleCI plugin and get the feedback on the config. So if I hover over here, I can see what a workflow is. If I do something like change the name of the job, it'll prompt me, let me know that there's not a match. Really, this is just a good way to get easy feedback for a dev. I don't have to commit to see these config errors. So the workflow refers over to the job stanza. And here's where I define what's actually going to happen when I invoke that job. Simple job example here with the Python check style. I define an execution environment. The Docker image is actually defined up here. And then I just define the steps that I want to run in that environment. It's really as simple as that to get up and running. For a developer, this is all easy to read and quick to understand what's going on. Now, if I have some things I know I want to use in multiple jobs, I can also make things reusable. It starts to get exhausting if I want to update something over 20 jobs if I'm running something at scale and I have to do it one by one. So I alluded to reusability with this executor stanza up here if I want to be able to plug and play there. But commands is another really good example. Or if I want to have some bash script logic here to get the credentials and to be able to do the logic that I want for OIDC. With Vault. So instead of having to put this everywhere and potentially make updates to them individually, I can drop this command in, this command name, load credentials, and just invoke it. DevX needs this to make it easier to enable developer and also remove some of that logic out of the actual job and manage it all in a central place. Now, the concept of managing one place works great here for single configs, single projects. But what if I want this policy to be global? That's a great opportunity to take that reusable config approach and do just that with orbs. So orbs, Again, CircleCI's package manager, they're hosted outside of the config in a registry, public or private, and I can pull them in down here like this with the orbs stanza. They're versioned, they're all in source control. They can be mandated with config policy management if required. Again, you can see I'm bringing in a few here. These are all certified and partner orbs. You can tell by the Atlassian CircleCI managing. This means that CircleCI, the partner, actually manages and maintains these and makes sure they cover a broad amount of use cases. Using the Maven as an example, we can see all up top, all I need to do is pull this in. So the Maven using their run a command with a cache, and then add a couple parameters that I want to run, and then I'm off to the races. It sets up the caching all under the hood. I don't have to worry about that logic. I just need to worry about the step that I want to run after it's cached. And if I jump into the orb registry, so I'm going to go back, I can take a peek. Let me make this a little bigger. Peek down here. So using the Maven as an example, what I just saw was this command with cache. If I'm curious, I want to see the options, the code for that command. I can go in here, see the parameters, which are optional, which are mandatory. I can see the actual source code as well. So if I want to take this, make it my own, it's a really good example of a way to go find it and see what you can do. The orb registry also has orbs created by our community that cover a lot of other use cases. It is the first place I go to look when I'm wondering how I might approach something, see how someone else did it. Okay, so we talked about everything from config all the way to deployment. Now I want to move on to making sense of things beyond a single run, so into insights. The insights dash, so this is the de facto place to see it all. It helps platform DevX teams see what's going on across the board and to see trends over time. Jumping in here, I see things pop up around cost control and then visibility. So credit usage trends, success rate trends. Let me go to, and I can see the different projects down here. Now, if I want to get a bit deeper, let me jump to 90 days, see a little more. Yeah, there we go. I can zoom in on that Bank of Ion project. So I could open up, see I've just been running that workflow, see the different branches. I'm going to run all branches here. And I can see a little more granular now. So main workflow, all branches, I can start seeing the runs. I can start seeing the success rate, durations. This is where I'm starting to look for anomalies, look for bottlenecks, see credit usage and workflow duration. So here's where I start to just get visibility into the bigger things I might want to take action on. But if I jump back up to the top, I can also go to the jobs page here. So this is one of my favorite tabs I go to. I'm going one level deeper. So this is a good example of where I can get those metrics, so duration, success rate, but at the job level. So it's a really good way to be like, okay, this one has to run. Here's where I could add some more resources, maybe tweak something to help optimize the whole workflow as a whole. And another thing I want to call out is it's a great way to get visibility into how you're using the resources provisioned. I can see here the CPU and RAM usage for all the resources. It's a great way to also manage costs. It's very visible if you're either underutilizing or overutilizing resources for a piece of work. I want to make sure I have the right size for the right job and find that Goldilocks zone and not make unnecessary trade-offs between speed and spend. So I want to be optimally using the resources provision. I mentioned at the top of this, this is quick, superficial linting feedback. Could probably use a small resource class. I'm actually using a pretty large resource class here, Docker XL. So this would be a good opportunity to downsize, something we could consult on, help you find the right usage and the way to optimally utilize all the resources that you are provisioning. All right, and then the test tab, another really fun one. All right, this is one of my favorites. So I can start seeing the test results for workflows. I can start seeing past failing, what's been happening. Flaky tests will start being brought up to to the forefront, and I can start seeing most failed tests. So which ones tend to fail a lot, and the slowest tests. So overall, these are things that I can actually use and take action on. Really cool, good way to help optimize, make sure you're getting the right success rates on this kind of stuff. And the last thing I want to touch on here is all of this is front and center. These are the types of things that we know are broadly applicable, but all this information, everything we just saw, in fact, is accessible in the API. So you can get whatever information you want with a few API calls. Under the hood, that's what we're doing. We're doing exactly the same thing. We're hitting our Insights API to populate all this information. Same thing with extensibility. If you want to send it out to some other third-party tool you're using, like a Datadog, Honeycomb, Grafana, whatever you're using to consume data, getting that information out and consuming it is really easy. Okay, so I have a couple other use cases to go through, and it doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment. So I'm going to touch on a few more use cases, and then we can open up for a general Q&A. So let's go ahead and start with dynamic configuration. So over here, so everything we saw thus far follows a pipeline. It kicks off a workflow that runs and ends with the pipeline. So in a situation, maybe you have one where you want to run some additional logic based on something like path changes for a monorepo, or based on some checks to another environment. And what if you want to use different configs based on some sort of combo of these situations? It'd be really helpful to not have to have all my pipeline parameters set at runtime in this case. So it's a perfect use case for dynamic configuration. And its functionality opened up by a continuation API endpoint. So what this means is, instead of having one workflow, we have multiple. We have a setup workflow that runs setup checks that are needed and then sets the correct parameters, and then a continuation workflow, or workflows which run the work that needs to be done based on those correct parameters. So there are a few reasons that someone might want to do this. And this list is a good starting point, but not all inclusive. It's very flexible. So one, if you have a monorepo and you don't want to build everything on every commit, we have a path filtering orb that checks for changes, and you can run conditional work based on the subdirectories with those changes. So it's a great way to manage resources, where if there's an important change, everything is tested. Whereas, if there's a README that changes, nothing's tested. It just runs a really quick one. So that would be the way to optimize that. I know some other folks in the space have their tools are have said things about how they do this in a really good way. It's a really simple thing to actually implement with dynamic config and path filtering. So that would be absolutely the way to go about doing that, to not run that conditional work. We don't need to. But if you want to use CircleCI for another thing, so another really cool use case that we see is using CircleCI for building and managing infrastructure. Another great use case. So we're using that here. We're spinning up, we're tearing down clusters and EKS based on branch patterns and some additional parameters that we can provide to tear things down. It's really important for platform teams to manage, if their config is code. This is a really great resource to be able to do that. And then the other one, if you want to specify your config file, if you don't want to specify, your config file at the time of processing, you can run logic to check for things like tags and issues, build the config from scratch, or specify the location of the one you'd like. So it lets you be more nimble and separate concerns, makes it really digestible. And then moving on to mobile. So that same logic that we saw has a pipeline, covers different architectures, and uses different use cases. This all applies to mobile as well. Because we have covered all the basics, it's just a matter of applying those fundamentals to this use case. You can see, the environments inside of a workflow, they're all interchangeable. So I'm just choosing the right tool again for the right job. I'm running some React Native stuff, so some testing, unit tests. These are all like a node, and then you can see I have some iOS and Android options up here. There are a lot of cloud-hosted Mac options for you to choose from. So we have a base one, we have M1, we have a bare metal. Really, whatever you need for your work, we have the Mac resources to support that. And And then you can build on Android machine images or on Docker convenience images, running all the steps to build your IPAs, APKs, interact with Fastlane, code sign, get the app out to all the stores. Something really cool here from a platform perspective is you can bring all of that mobile development into the fold and not have to manage separate tools. Everything is covered here, and those organizational metrics and insights, they can be easily tracked across all the teams in that insights dashboard. And I talked about in terms of, let's go to runner. In terms of build resources, you can use cloud or you can also self-host. These can live together in harmony. And I want you to think of self-hosting as like a different offering. It's more of a flavor of how to approach cloud. So this can be useful for a number of reasons. Good ones if you need privilege access and controls. So you want a resource class behind the firewall. A lot of people do something like that for deployment. Another is if you want some exotic compute you need to run on. So something really out there, maybe something where you have a licensed software already installed on a machine sitting next to you. Then again, you might just also want more control over resources. So that's also a very fair option. And like all of these things together, these allow platform teams to handle whatever the different dev teams throw their way in needs of support. What I do want to highlight is what I'm using. So it's one we call Container Runner. So this is the same workflow, but on a different branch where I do have Container Runner set up. So I have a clustered provision to run work. Actually, in this case, it's on my Minikube on my computer. It spins up pods as needed and tears them down. And they pull in whichever Docker image is noted in the config. So it feels the same as using the cloud for the end user in terms of management. So I can see here, I have the Docker XL for this. But over here, I'm running this on just a runner that we have provisioned locally. So good way to mix and match for the needs. Okay, now in terms of prepared content, that is it. So love to open it up to questions. We got about 20 something minutes for Q&A. So please don't be shy. Yeah, we have a question around config policy management. So to go a bit deeper into that, I'd love to. So I have an example here of ones that we're actually applying. So it's Rego. And it is defined either you can define it to be at an org level or at a project level, and you're just writing out some of these policies. So the ones we just saw, there it is. This is a fairly heavy one, so it's running a lot of logic on the config file. We recommend doing something like this where you're storing it in a repository separate. So again, config as code. You can also use the CLI to provision and manage policies. But really, if you want to look at some of the more simple ones, conceptually, all you're doing is saying what you want to have in the config, and then if you want to have it at the org level or a certain project level. So let me pull up a couple examples. We have some helpers here. So we have orbs to make things easier. So if you want to make sure that someone is using or ban a certain orb, enabling the rule and hard failing, this is really the basics, and then you're off to the races. A really cool one, I showed the context stuff, but this is very new way to restrict usage. So you can block certain contexts from certain projects. You could also block certain contexts by the branch. So making sure this is going to be right down here. Yes, this is the branch. So, that content, the super special prod context only on main branch, you would be able to implement this here and ensure organization-wide that no one could use these secret contexts or this array on a protected branch like that. It's a great way to actually protect. And then you have these, again, in GitHub, living in source code, probably gated to by some approval process as well. And we do recommend running some sort of like CI also on change validation for this. So we do have a config file to actually apply the policies and to run some tests on it. So we can follow up with some more docs on that. And one of my colleagues actually did a full webinar on CPM recently, so I can follow up with that also. I see a question about feeding a variable during execution. I do have a follow-up question on that. Clarification is that, like, as the job is running, you want to add a different variable, or to like manually add a variable before kicking off a job? Yeah, okay. So manually is the note. So let me just run on that. So if I want to trigger this pipeline, so this would be where you would be able to add a parameter here. If I'm going to kick this off, I can't remember what the parameter actually is that I use for this. But actually, let me PI. So be able to add those parameters here in this trigger pipeline. Keep them saved. I have it set up on another project, but not here. So I have on the Circle demo React, I do have it set up to run API tests when a certain parameter is present. So that's like a good way to actually run conditional workflows if an API of a parameter is present. And the same thing, if I'm running dynamic config and I want to check for something else and not have to manually do it, automate that logic, what I would do is probably run some scripting in the setup workflow, set the parameters that I want, and then pass those in for the follow-up workflow. And there's a question about storing a file in CircleCI, so like a private key that will be read in the code. A lot of times that's done for something like a GCP, I believe. A lot of times they need a file for that. And absolutely, so you just want to base64 encode it and store it. So if you type in, there's a support article around base64 encoding a file, and it'll give you an example on how to go and do that. So it'll be here for the example. Any other questions on maybe the plugin or anything around here? I know we covered off CPM. That was a new feature. Test splitting, and there should be plenty of examples around test splitting, just how to implement that. But even with the globbing patterns used, we do have a new feature around test splitting coming out, so might as well mention it too. So if you have a test that, if you have a test suite that fails, let's say you have a 20-minute test suite and it fails 2 minutes in, we have a fail fast feature. So if there's going to be a failure anyways, it doesn't run the full test before we get that feedback, it'll fail when that batch of tests actually finishes. So we'll look out for the fail fast if you want to try to get some quicker feedback on that. Yeah, but a really cool way to approach test splitting is like with a monorepo, I have all these subdirectories. Let's say I have, in this one, I have API, a client, and then a CLI tool that I'm building, and then I have the docs. So, if I'm building all the main things, I can run test splitting on all those different test suites individually. But again, if I'm not running those, and I just like change the docs or change something quickly, I don't actually have to run any tests. So it's another way to filter and be more granular. So using dynamic config and the test splitting, really cool way to go approach that. Good question. But so when a job fails, execution stops, it's possible to continue next jobs on failed. So the ways to orchestrate these things together, let me pull up a good example here. So this is a mobile app here. If this fails, the integration test will not continue. But if you want to run something on failure, what you could go about or approach you could take would be to run a webhook to run something on failure. So I could parameterize a webhook to, run a follow-up workflow with a failure potentially. But typically with this dependency graph, if I wanted something to run after, I wouldn't set it up to run after. So I'd probably run it separately or a different workflow. If you have a more context around a situation where you're asking for that example, I can probably, there we go. Oh, for this, okay. So the question is to publish the test result. You can still, I would keep that as part of the same job. And you can have a step execute only on failure. So there's pull this thing up too. Configuring, here we go. So you have like a when on fail if you want to have like some steps only execute on failure, but in reality, I would just keep I would probably just run always to store those published test results and keep them as part of the same job. That would be how I would personally set that up. But very common. Obviously, you want the test results to get out when you are running something like that. And what's happening for the test results, I can show you. So these steps, you just have like a when always, or make sure they do get stored. And other cool ways to use, I guess, if we have some time, would be start stringing other triggers or other things to kick off workflows. So I see other people, some folks we work with that will, maybe on a change in a Docker image starts triggering a different workflow with some different parameters. So like that trigger with different parameters, that becomes really powerful to run some conditional work. So one of my things I try to lean heavily into. It helps you compartmentalize and split up different workflows in different ways. So, keep them focused on the concern. All right, looks like it's slowing down a bit with the questions. So I'll give another minute for any other questions. If anyone needs to drop, thank you so much for joining. Another question, is it possible to trigger a project from another project? So example, project A pass triggers project B. Absolutely. So the actually same API call, the kickoff pipelines, you can automate that. I think there's also an orb that folks have written out to do that, and you just trigger those together. I think we're actually looking into making it more native inside the project. But it's a really good question. Yep, pass some parameters, like where this is coming from, and what you want to do. So I'd pass a couple of parameters and run some logic based on that. So the API endpoint is pipeline, trigger a new pipeline. So the project that you want to trigger, and then the parameters that you want to pass in. So if you want to pass in tag, branch, whatever you want to pass in, you just do that with this API call to kind of string these things together. Good question. Follow-up question was, can you do this between two organizations? If you want to, you'd want to have in reality, I'd probably want to sit down and talk about the why and make sure it's the right structure to go about this. But if it's a completely different GitHub org, you could still, if you had the token to run the API call, you could store that in Vault, or you could store that somewhere and still run this piece. But I haven't seen multi-org as often. It's typically multi-repos. So something lives in a different complete organization, then typically that's going to live separate because it's going to have different like inside stash, unless you're getting it out through like extensibility to another data source. But that's a good, that's a good one to follow up on if you have some more questions. Talk to some folks in our team because we could probably help map that out. So it's a lot of what I end up doing is just like trying to map out things and find the right approach. All right, looks like that's about it. Thanks everyone. Connect with me on GitHub, LinkedIn. Let me know if you have any questions. It was fun. Have a good rest of the day.